Alexander the Great. It's easily one of the most celebrated names in all of human history, right? We all know the titles: conqueror of the Persian Empire, the invincible general, the absolute unparalleled military genius. But what if there's actually another way to look at this story? What if we pop the hood and really look at the mechanics of his legendary status? In this explainer, we're going to ask a kind of disruptive question. What if Alexander's astronomical success wasn't just the result of raw military talent, but also relied incredibly heavily on an extraordinary, almost unbelievable sequence of lucky events? Welcome to an explainer that honestly might just change how you view historical greatness forever.
To do this, we're actually going to borrow a fascinating psychological lens from Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman had this brilliantly simple idea about how we measure achievement. He basically said that normal, standard success equals talent plus luck. But when you look at astronomical, world-altering success, his formula shifts. Immense success equals a little more talent plus a massive, massive amount of luck. And we're going to use this exact behavioral formula today to reevaluate history.
And to ground this analytical reading, we're looking directly at the narrative framing presented in the Netflix series Alexander, the Making of a God. We're basically bridging pop culture with behavioral psychology here. The series actually does a fantastic job showing the gritty, moment-to-moment reality of his campaigns. And, when you look really closely at those specific moments, you start to see a theme. Was Alexander a genius? Unquestionably. But was he also a textbook example of luck massively amplifying that talent? Let's find out.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Section 1, the first near end. Granicus. So this happens right at the very beginning of his Asian campaign at the Battle of the Granicus. This is the exact moment where the myth literally almost died before it even began. The narrative shows Alexander making an incredibly bold decision. He personally leads the cavalry charge directly into the Persian lines. Now sure, this is super inspiring, but let's be honest, it's also wildly reckless. By diving headfirst into the thick of the fighting, he exposes himself to brutal, totally unpredictable hand-to-hand combat. He leaves himself completely vulnerable. There's no grand strategy protecting him in the mud and blood of the front lines. And then, the inevitable happens. A Persian noble gets the upper hand, raises his weapon, and is literal fractions of a second away from bringing it down on Alexander, who has absolutely no way out.
And this brilliantly illustrates the razor-thin margin of history. At that exact microsecond, one of his officers, Cletus, intervenes and severs the Persian's arm, saving Alexander's life with seconds to spare. Just think about that for a second. The entire course of Western history literally hung on a few lucky seconds. If Cletus had tripped, or hesitated, or just been a half-step slower, the story ends right there. There is no Alexander the Great, just a reckless young king who died in his very first major battle.
So I've got to ask you directly, was surviving this encounter a masterstroke of military planning, or was it just the first massive stroke of luck in Alexander's career? A single, isolated event like this reveals something absolutely crucial. Sometimes, history doesn't pivot on grand designs, but on split-second chance.
Moving on to Section 2, an enemy that sabotages itself.
Now, surviving a battle is one thing, but conquering an entire empire requires a really specific set of conditions. And here, Alexander hit the absolute jackpot when it comes to who he was actually fighting. He didn't face a fully functional, united enemy. The Persian Empire under Darius III was a giant, yes, but a stumbling one. It was politically fragmented, with regional governors or satraps just constantly bickering with each other. It was militarily uncoordinated, leading to painfully slow, disjointed responses. Now, Alexander didn't create this highly favorable scenario. He merely stumbled right into it. So you have to ask, how much of his success was his own momentum, and how much was simply the structural weakness of his adversary?
Section 3, Issus, when errors decide.
All right, at the Battle of Issus, we see an unforced era of monumental proportions completely decide the fate of a conflict. Darius held a massive, almost overwhelming numerical superiority over Alexander. In ancient warfare, that is a game-winning advantage. But look at his execution. Darius actually chooses to fight on a narrow coastal plain. It is a devastatingly poor choice of terrain. By fighting in a literal bottleneck, Darius completely nullifies his own strength. His gigantic army can't expand. They literally get in their own way. Their greatest asset becomes their greatest liability. Alexander executes his tactics perfectly, yes, but the decisive condition of the battle was handed to him on a silver platter by his enemy's catastrophic mistake.
So you're probably noticing a pattern starting to emerge here. Alexander is undoubtedly a brilliant commander who knows exactly how to capitalize on an opening. But those decisive openings, they are consistently being provided by monumental enemy failures. His flawless execution is constantly being paired with incredible systemic luck on the exact opposite side of the battlefield.
Section 4. The butterfly effect of flinning. And the thing is, the Battle of Issus doesn't just end with military defeat. It triggers a profound butterfly effect, driven entirely by the Persian king's psychological collapse. As the battle turns, Darius panics, flees, and dramatically abandons absolutely everything. He leaves behind his own family, his royal treasure, and, maybe most importantly, his political legitimacy. This isn't just a military win for Alexander, it's a total political and psychological collapse of the Persian leadership. Alexander inherits this immense symbolic victory just because of a contingent, panic-driven decision made by his opponent. Alexander didn't force Darius to abandon his family, Darius just did it, and Alexander reaped the massive rewards.
Section 5. Tyre and the external factor.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, but surely Alexander's great sieges were entirely his own doing, right? Take the famous Siege of Tyre, which is this marvel of engineering where he built a literal bridge across the sea to a fortified island. But hold on. Here is the critical external factor. Despite all that brilliant engineering and sheer willpower, full success at Tyre was completely dependent on receiving critical naval support from other Phoenician cities. Alexander didn't actually have a massive navy of his own. If those external fleets hadn't flipped to his side, which was a factor completely outside his direct absolute control, he would have faced a critical and perhaps insurmountable limitation. So even in his greatest tactical achievements, he needed the stars to align externally.
Section 6. Gaugamela. Victory and repeating the pattern.
Here at Gaugamela, we see the exact same pattern repeat itself, but on the grandest scale imaginable. Let's compare the setup versus the reality. The Persian setup was perfect. Darius had time to literally smooth out the battlefield for his chariots. He had overwhelming numbers. He had the planning. The odds were entirely in his favor. But the reality? Once the battle begins, the Persian execution fails completely. And incredibly, Darius loses his nerve and flees yet again. Déjà vu, right?
This really summarizes the core of our explainer. Alexander wins, but his enemies collapse disproportionately. This repeating cycle proves something vital. Luck wasn't just a one-off event back at the Granicus. It is an unbelievable, escalating pattern of contingency. He is repeatedly finding himself in positions where his enemy blinks, panics, or just makes the worst possible choice at the absolute worst possible time.
Section 7. Surviving the improbable.
In his later campaigns in Central Asia and India, it's not even just about winning battles anymore. It's about his mere physical survival, bordering on statistical impossibility. The narrative shows an Alexander who is increasingly reckless. He suffers incredibly severe injuries. We're talking a collapsed lung from an arrow, a cleaved helmet. He constantly leads direct attacks, putting himself at the very front of sieges. Now, surviving that level of danger once, that's skill. Surviving it twice, incredible resilience. But repeatedly surviving these brutal, life-threatening realities over a decade, that is pure probability favoring him again and again and again.
Section 8. Kahneman's formula applied.
So, bringing all this historical evidence full circle back to Daniel Kahneman's formula, we've seen the near-death saves, the unforced errors, the external interventions. Alexander the Great was, without question, immensely talented. He had vision, he had charisma, and he had tactical brilliance. But as this explainer shows, he perfectly embodies Kahneman's formula for world-altering success. He fits right into the absolute rarest category, immense talent, supercharged by an absolutely incredible, sustained run of luck.
And that leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought to take away from this explainer. Does acknowledging this immense luck diminish his greatness? Honestly, not at all. But it absolutely changes how we understand the mechanics of history. The greatest names in our past aren't just the most brilliant. They're often the ones who repeatedly found themselves in the right place at the right time with enemies who made the wrong choices, and they survived just long enough for it to matter. So, Alexander the Great or Alexander the Lucky? Perhaps the most honest answer is that to truly change the world, you kinda have to be both, inseparably. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep questioning the history you think you know.